Hi everybody, welcome to another episode of Historia Politica Pública. This is another episode about the book written by Mark Mazower, Governing the World, the History of an Idea. In the previous episode of this series, I talked about how the colonization was rationalized by the intellectuals in the second half of the 19th century in order to obtain legitimacy to go to other places, conquer, exploit their resources, and enslave their people. In this episode, I wanted to start with the episode 4 of the book, which is called Science the Unifier, and it analyzes how the modern technologies help from 1850 onwards to create a kind of intellectual hub among the world, develop the different technologies for communication, and it was a great attempt to try to group together different communities that were living across the world. In that sense, there was a word that was kind of coined at that time. It was called codification, which referred to the accumulation of information and categorizing it. In other words, it was like the modern bibliography that we consider now, or this kind of virtual library in which we can access like millions of different documents in order to proceed to learn, to teach, or develop our investigations. For doing so, it was important the standardization. In other words, the creation of the International Telegraph Union to manage the time, the measures, the weight, and so on. Have a set of time. It was fundamental for the arrival of the trains. I think the first train in Britain was in 1831, if I don't remember correctly, from Manchester to Liverpool. And the train station is a kind of epitome of the idea of the clock and the setting of a standard time in order to establish an order within the world. In that sense, Saint Simon is the theories of the scientific organization of society, which was fundamental for trying to unify the different societies across the world. Another important figure is Paul Otlet. He was the founder of modern information science and the bibliographer, again, the data collection. So, from 1885 until 1914, there was an apogee of technical and scientific internationalism. This time it is very important. It is considered as one of the most peaceful periods in Europe. The last war had happened in 1871 between France and Prussia. It was the conflict that gave Bismarck legitimacy to finally create the state of Germany. He was very smart to outbursting the nationalist feeling within the different regions of Prussia to hold them together and channel into rage to go to war into France. After the war, the nationalist feeling was so high that the German state was able to be created. So from 1871 until 1914, there was no wars in Europe. It was a time of huge advance of technology. Liberalism had seemed to be considered as the only possible ideology at that time. It was an ideology that emphasized the individual freedom to create new technologies, to delve further and explore into the different subjects of society. What happened in 1914, as we perfectly know, the First World War occurred. That was a consequence of the increment of technology among the different powers. It was the first war in the history in which the modern warfare was used to destroy other opponents. Also, it happened because Germany wanted to have colonies, same as British and France, that had occupied a great part of the world. So, as Engels predicted in the 1880s and also Kropotkin, there would be an inevitably worldwide conflict between the mighty superpowers because the world, the earth is finite, and these countries wanted to expand along the territories. However, in order to do so, they needed to enter inevitably in conflict between them. At that time, there was also specialization, documentation, the goal to produce a universal book based on international coordination, and Paul Otlet wanted to provide knowledge to those who need it. In that sense, it appeared an idea that was absolutely brilliant. It was the dream of the Mundanium, which can be translated as World Palace. So the idea to establish a world city that would be Brussels, in which there was an international library, a museum, and universities. Such a kind of intellectual hub for the people to go in there and get information, engage with different societies, learn from each other, and so on. There was an international diplomatic council, a sign of progress with the city, the county, the duchy, national state, and supranational body. All of this was obviously created from above, and certainly it will benefit the upper classes. At that time, remember, not many people were literate, so also there was no democracy and people could not vote for this kind of measures that, even though they were great in paper, they could not be fruitful because did not count with the appeal of the mass of people. So a world palace nowadays will be a extraordinary idea if it had an egalitarian approach to help different people in the world to become informed. However, after the war that finished in 1918, the optimism faded, and the Mundanium closed in 1934 after during the interwar period and 2 years before the Spanish Civil War. The thing is, like, the 20s and the 30s saw the collapse of the League of Nations, the Weimar Republic in Germany, and the Mundanium, these kind of measures that were trying to establish a new system based on new values, trying to cooperate with the international community and establish an international society. It was a difficult period with the collapse of the empire, the rise of fascism, the threat of communism in the East, the collapse of liberalism in the First World War. Henceforth, there were many different ideologies, people were confused, there was crisis, the governments did not know how to proceed, and in fact they implement a eugenics policy across Europe to establish a scientific management of the society. People were pushed from their homes, there were millions of refugees in Europe, and all this outbursts or discontent was channeled by the most violent ideologies that had occurred in modern history, which were translated into fascism. So, what H.G. Wells, the writer of The Time Machine, The Invisible Man, The Island of Dr. Moreau, When the Sleeper Awakes, or The World of Worlds, called that kind of Mundanium idea as the world brain in the 1930s. But apart from the kind of violent currents that were isolating Europe, there was problem of scientific cooperation. There was the codification meant a disagreement between the US and the United Kingdom with France, for instance, same as with the setting up of an international epidemics agency. Does it resonate what is happening nowadays? France traditionally had wanted to disalign with USA even before the Cold War with General de Gaulle, as we have seen now. Did not want to kind of ally with the English language, and also the International Epidemics Agency. We see how during COVID-19 there were different organizations that trying to work by their own means. There was a time in which Oxford had developed its own vaccine. There were 5 more vaccines as British people, and they were not able to share, they were not willing to share with other people. At the same time, during the pandemic, there was organizations that were trying to work for the Commonwealth, such as sharing their own technologies advanced and so on. In other words, we see how technology can be used for the well-being of the humanity, or by greedy owners of the means of production in order to enrich themselves. Also, as Mazower mentioned, going to our current times, he points how with global warming or the patent liberation, the existence of a commonly acknowledged problem was not enough to generate an effective bureaucratic response. This has a clear echo, as Mazower mentioned, point to the ideas of global warming or the liberation of the patents that happened during the COVID-19. Even though everybody realized that there is a common problem nowadays, the main threat is climate change, it is difficult to get an agreement between different countries. It is true that in the last COP, the COP27 in Egypt, celebrated last November, there was a kind of interesting agreement in which the most polluting companies agreed to provide with resources, with means, economic fundings to the poor countries in order that they could develop themselves. I don't know if this agreement is going to be fulfilled, but still the idea is very important to do that. And as Mazower explains in the book, the power of the ideas have been fundamental for the change of the paradigms in societies. So what happened at the time as it's happening now? As science is being funded by the state, at that time the international aim to favor the globe failed strepitously because everybody seems to want to favor their own country. And in that sense, it was created the idea to implement Esperanto to foster internationalism, a different language that was not the main one in any country. But as we know now, English language is like the global language speaking around the world. So in that time, there were great ideas, but also problems of nationalism, kind of curtail what otherwise was great idea. If we go to the chapter 13, which is called Humanity Law, there is how after the Cold War, there is a new world order, the expansion of the United Nations, responsibilities and powers in the humanitarian realm. Officials become political agents in many countries. There was the so-called humanitarian intervention, which is, according to Mazower, making war by another name. And he points how the United Nations and the NATO had freedom to intervene in order to save, as they call them, failed states. There was also euphemisms like treaty of peace and exceptional response. These documents that had been signed in the United Nations conferences had been widely debated by the mighty powers, had served for NATO to intervene in Yugoslavia, in Libya, United States, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and many other countries, which different results, like in Somalia, in Rwanda, Yugoslavia again. According to Mazower, this was mismanagement of the US and the UN. There was a legislative problem because the United Nations, that allegedly must be an impartial body to operate in a supranational basis, needed the support of the Western powers in order to intervene effectively. So we have the paradox now that the US has imposed a blockade in Cuba that had lasted for 61 years. The United Nations is holding votes to avoid this blockade, but just with the votes of United States and Israel against the lifting of the blockade persists. So, in other words, the United States controls NATO, controls the United Nations, and for that reason had become the hegemonical power, especially since the 1945, the end of the Second World War. He also points to an interesting quote by Tony Blair, the former Prime Minister of Britain, when he said, "We are witnessing the beginning of a new doctrine of international community." And there was a Canadian report in 2001 that in order to report the legitimization of interventions, mentioned how there was a responsibility to protect. So with the coming of the 21st century, a new juncture appeared over the world. There was a responsibility for Western powers to impose their doctrines in different parts of the world. So the same as they have done for many centuries, but later on with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the signing of new documents, the humanities law, as Mazower pointed, they create themselves as the masters of the planet, and they have been keeping doing so since then. There is also the American interventionism in the so-called War of Terror, which increased the tendency for legitimize the spending on international military action. Also, the ideal rhetorical vehicle for intervention, how universal humanity and international community was threatened by different kind of menace that usually happen in the Middle East and areas of Asia, like China nowadays, Iran, Russia, in Europe, and other parts of the world. So in 2006, United States established those documents of security concerns with the language of moral responsibility. This is very important because the rhetoric employed by implement those ideas was trying to give the image of living in a Manichaean world in which the Western powers were the good people and they had to defeat the evils that did not believe in democracy and they were authoritarian. That sense, the invasion of Libya in 2011 was carried as a kind of the norm of how the world politics will operate. And in that time, Security Council backed the NATO intervention in Libya. And Mark Mazower, and to finish this episode, he asks, where are the limits of intervention? Why Gaddafi was ousted in Libya, but NATO or the USA is not intervening in countries like Gaza, the Tibet, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, and so on. Saudi Arabia is buying weapons from the Western powers, and they have been bombing Yemen for 8 years now. Over 400,000 people have been killed. Israel has been occupying Palestine territory and killing thousands of people for many years. International Amnesty has defined this approach of Israel as an apartheid state, comparing it with the segregation imposed by South Africa in the 20th century. But why? Well, the reason it seems easy to see. Saudi Arabia is buying money for the Western powers. Western powers are getting money for Saudi Arabia, so they don't really care if thousands, hundreds of thousands of Yemeni are being killed all the time. And this is the problem that Mazower points with the humanities law that has been created by an established mighty power. So the in theory unbiased approach that will need to take organizations such as the United Nations and other supranational bodies are following interests of a particular powers that are being directed by the United States. And I will finish here the episode. We'll keep talking about other chapters of the book that are also very interesting to analyze how 19th and 20th century have been kind of directed for many different ideas that have been that serve to save the world in which we live nowadays.